It was definitely brave of Sony to enter the handheld console market back in 2005. Nintendo had dominated the market since the Game Boy, largely thanks to great exclusives such as Pokemon. If the PSP was ever going to be relevant, it had to make sure it had its own great exclusives. The approach that Sony took to make this happen was to take their PS2 titles and make spin-off games that were only available on the PSP. As they were only spin-offs and the PSP wasn't as powerful as the PS2, most of these games are now largely forgotten. The Jak and Daxter series got two PSP games, Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier, which I have already reviewed, and Daxter, which I'll be looking at today. There are two things about this game that separates it from other PSP games. The first is that it was the first game that Ready at Dawn Studios ever made, Ready at Dawn being the company who's currently making the Order 1866 for the PS4. The second thing is that Daxter never got ported to the PS2. The majority of these PSP spin-off games were eventually ported to the PlayStation 2, including Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier, but Daxter never was, and has never seen any sort of re-release. So, is it a good thing that the game never got ported, or is it actually a great game? Let's have a look. The story takes place in between Jak 1 and 2. The plot focuses on Daxter and tells the events that leads up to Daxter rescuing Jak at the beginning of Jak 2. During the game, Daxter becomes a bug exterminator in Haven City before eventually trying to rescue Jak from the Baron. As a spin-off, the story works. The story starts off fairly weak, as it is weird to see Daxter working as a bug exterminator, but once Daxter remembers about Jak, things start to pick up. It's interesting seeing everything that led up to the beginning of Jak 2, but if you haven't played Jak 2, you might find the story to just be weak. Although Daxter has a self-contained story, the main appeal is to give extra context to Jak 2, which for me was enough. I don't think anyone playing Daxter is expecting an amazing story, but there is definitely enough nods to previous Jak games to make it worth checking out if you're a fan of the series. Daxter is a 3D platformer. The controls at the beginning are very basic. X jumps, square attacks, and triangle allows you to crawl. At first, Daxter feels more slippery than you would expect thanks to the PSP's analog stick. While in Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier movement was strict so the player could strafe easier, in Daxter you do have full 3D movement. The way the developers compensated for the PSP's awful stick was to have Daxter maintain more of his momentum than you would expect when you change direction. It might take you a little while to get used to how Daxter handles, but after the first level you should be completely adjusted, and at no point in the game did Daxter sliding all over the place cause me to unfairly make a mistake. While Daxter starts out with a basic moveset, he soon acquires an extermination tank. The tank allows Daxter to spray bug spray at enemies to stun them. Later in the game you also acquire a flamethrower upgrade and an ultrasound emitter which acts as a grenade launcher. The game gives you small upgrades throughout, which allows the gameplay to gradually build upon itself as you progress. The first few levels feel very simple as you're just making jumps and beating up bugs, but by the end of the game you'll be using your bug spray to hover across gaps, taking out enemies with the flamethrower, as well as finding your way through a maze by blowing up walls. The upgrades you get help every level feel fresh and interesting, as each level will have you use the extermination tank in different ways. For example, the flamethrower is effective against enemies, but in one level you must use it to burn away spiderwebs, while in another you must use it to melt ice blocks to create platforms for yourself. There's something more satisfying about using a small amount of items in multiple ways, rather than a large amount of items which only have one use each. The level themes are varied, but use quite generic locations. You could pick out any of these levels and they would fit in quite well with a lot of different platformers. To give a few examples of what I mean, there's a mine level, a construction site level, and a ship level. None of the level themes are that unique, but it's not a major issue. While the levels don't have that distinct Jak and Daxter feel, from level to level you are exploring completely new areas. Rather than the game having an overall theme, each level stands by itself. Whether this means the game lacks personality or not is up to you, but I liked each level not being connected as it helps the game avoid feeling samey. The game does maintain the same structure as Jak 2 though. You drive through Haven City to a mission marker on your map, jump into a level, talk to whoever's there and complete a task for them in the level. While Haven City is technically an open world, it mostly exists as a hub, so don't expect the same level of interactivity as Jak 2. I wouldn't say this is a complaint, as Daxter is much more focused on platforming than Jak 2, so if it did have a large open world it would feel unnecessary. There are two things that makes Daxter really stand out to me. The first is that there's nothing in the game that ruins the experience. The controls are solid and there are no annoyances, you just play through the levels enjoying yourself. This might not sound like much of a compliment, but when a platformer is bad, it's normally because it's either frustrating or boring, and Daxter is neither. For those who enjoy Jak 2's difficulty, you might find the game a bit on the easy side. You will find yourself dying quite a lot when playing, but the game is quite generous with the checkpoints. I found the difficulty to be just right, as there are still challenging sections, but the game doesn't waste your time by making you play up to the hard part when you die. If you do want to make the game more of a challenge, you can try and get 100%. In each level there are a certain number of hidden precursor orbs as well as golden bug gems. Golden bug gems drop whenever you kill an enemy, so to get 100% you need to make sure you squash every bug in a level. The precursor orbs act as your standard collectible item. They are scattered throughout levels, although as there is a large number of them to collect, none of them are too out of the way. You just have to keep an eye out for them and make sure you explore levels fully. Now the second thing that makes Daxter stand out to me is that it feels like an old PS1 platformer. The levels are linear and use generic themes, the open world is limited and you slowly get more moves throughout the game. It doesn't try to fit into what gaming had become back in 2006 and keeps all the traditions that 3D platformers used to have back on the PlayStation 1. As good as Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy is, with its expansive levels, large amount of dialogue and one seamless world, it does fit into its own separate category. Daxter isn't like that, but at the same time I wouldn't say it feels dated. This is mostly thanks to Ready at Dawn pushing the PSP by having solid graphics, and there are a decent number of open areas throughout the game. You could argue my nostalgia for N64 and PS1 platformers is making me a bit biased here, but any game that reminds me of Rayman 2 The Great Escape can't be bad. I mentioned earlier about the upgrades making levels more interesting, but there are also other gameplay styles. There are levels where you're riding around on a hover vehicle, which can either be a chase scene or you just have to drive around an open area. The balance between platforming and driving is similar to Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy, so there are only a few times where you take control of a vehicle if you don't include Haven City. These sections are a solid distraction, but nothing more. There are also dream sequences where you play as Daxter in different film parodies. It is entertaining to see Daxter take part in all these different films, but the gameplay comes down to Simon Says button presses, which feels a bit lame. There are other times in the game where you have to push buttons as they come across the screen, and they're also lame. These minigames are always short and aren't terrible, they just feel a bit lazy. Daxter took me around 7 hours to beat, which is shorter than any of the main series Jak games. However, I would say that the game still feels full with content, although that might be because it's a PSP title. Daxter is one of the best 3D platformers I've played in years. I know I may not have made a convincing argument for how good the game is in this review, but when it comes to platformers, when they're good, they're just good. Maybe Daxter doesn't have as good as a story as the other Jak games or a distinct personality, but it's a great throwback to how 3D platformers used to be. The levels are simple but well put together and I really enjoy playing through them all. My score is 8.5 out of 10. Daxter separates itself from the main Jak series to remind us how fun a simple, well-made 3D platformer can be.